Space operas are a staple in the science fiction diet and one of the most popular subgenres for fans. The space opera is defined as being science fiction that emphasises space warfare and somewhat melodramatic adventure. Hartwell and Kramer define space opera in their 2006 anthology The Space Opera Renaissance as colourful, dramatic, large-scale science fiction adventure, competently and sometimes beautifully written, usually focused on a sympathetic, heroic, central character and plot action, and usually set in the relatively distant future and in space or on other worlds, characteristically optimistic in tone. It often deals with war, piracy, military virtues, and very large-scale action, large stakes. The more classic definition of the space opera is that they are set mainly or entirely in space and often feature technological advancements such as faster-than-light travel, futuristic weaponry and sophisticated technology, as well as social changes such as a galactic empire, interstellar warfare and alien contact. The definition, however, has changed somewhat from when the subgenre first began. Today, the popular sci-fi work by Frank Herbert, Dune, is considered by many to be a space opera, yet it doesn't meet the criteria of actually being even partly set in space, but is instead set on the alien world of Arrakis. So today's space opera could be defined as being any type of adventure space fiction story with grandeur themes. Early works of what would later become space opera were known as proto-space opera. Robert William Cole's The Struggle for Empire, a story of the year 2236, published in 1900, has been credited as being the very first space opera. The novel depicts an interstellar conflict between solar men of Earth and a fierce humanoid race headquartered on Sirius. It wasn't until 1941 that the term space opera was first used, however, when author Wilson Tucker first coined it as a derogatory term. At the time, serial radio dramas in the US had become known as soap operas because many were sponsored by soap manufacturers. Tucker defined space opera as the science fiction equivalent, a, quote, hacky, grinding, stinking, outworn spaceship yarn. The term horse opera had also come into use to describe formulaic Western films, and some critics noted that the plots of space operas sometimes took themselves from horse operas, translated into an outer space environment. Before this, when what we now consider space opera began to appear regularly in pulp magazines during the late 1920s and early 30s, these were often referred to as super science epics. Eventually, space opera became, for many readers, no longer a derogatory term, but instead a description for a science fiction adventure story, and writers such as Paul Anderson were prevalent in the 1950s in writing about large-scale space adventure. Following the new wave science fiction movement in the 60s and 70s, the space opera became known as the good old stuff, basically something of the past. However, this wasn't the case. By the early 1980s, space operas were again redefined, and the label was attached to major popular culture works such as Star Wars. In the early 1990s, the redefined term space opera was recognised as a legitimate science fiction genre. This new space opera evolved around the same time as cyberpunk and was influenced by its darker, edgier nature. Many new space opera writers use the genre to explore character development, fine writing, high literary standards, verisimilitude, and a moral exploration of contemporary social issues. Ian N. Banks, Stephen Baxter, Alistair Reynolds, Peter F. Hamilton, Anne Leckie, and Justina Robson are among notable writers of the new space opera.